Hey guys, welcome back to Spectra Creative. I'm your host, Scott Toy Guru Neitlich, because, well, I'm your host. That's how it works. I want to talk today about what people call modern Star Wars collecting. Action figures, that is. I guess there's lots of things you can collect from Star Wars, from, t-shirts to beach towels. But obviously this channel is mostly about toy collecting with the occasional book, video game, and history and hieroglyphics sidetrack. But what I'm finding really interesting is, well, we're basically now about 30 years into what would be called, I guess, what fans call modern Star Wars collecting, which started in 1995 with the Power of the Force 2 launch. I remember I got Chewbacca. That was my very first modern Star Wars figure. Now, I was also a big collector. Well, I was a kid when, the original line came out. I mean, look at how beat up my Walrus Man is. I mean, this guy has had some serious playtime. And when Power of the Force 2 relaunched in 1995, a lot of us kind of figured it was, just one, fire in the pan. I don't think anyone expected to get 30 years of Star Wars toys. And it's interesting because the original line that started in 79, 78, they couldn't get toys out in time for the movie. It came out next Christmas. We all know that story about the early bird pack. So it didn't even last 10 years. I mean, it went 78 to 85, right? 85 was when Power of the Force 1, or just Power of the Force, came out. And that was kind of the end of what was considered vintage or, classic Star Wars collecting. And then 10 years went by, 85 to 95. And in 95, we got Power of the Force 2, which we covered 2 minutes ago in this video. You can rewind and I will tell you all about that because I just did. So moving forward, what's interesting is, for 30 years now, we've talked about modern Star Wars collecting, but we're now farther away from from Power of the Force 2 than Power of the Force 2 was from the original line in 85, right? Because 10 years passed, but now it's been 30 years of collecting Power of the Force 2 and Saga and Vintage and all of that. So what I wanted to kind of do with this video, something I've noticed being a Star Wars action figure collector for, 40 years plus, kind of scary, is what people call the modern line, starting with 95, is really broken up into what I see as 3 phases. And I want to go through that and kind of talk about the differences, the aesthetic changes, and where we are now and where we might go forward. So first off, to kind of give a baseline, I think it's important to note that really the big reason that Star Wars has continued is because of the new content. Obviously we got the prequels gave Star Wars a big boost. And then along came, obviously, the Disney movies and Disney Plus, which they haven't been the best toy sellers, but they've kept Star Wars in the aisle. So whether or not something like Acolyte or Episode 9 you consider great or terrible, it doesn't matter. The point is that gave permission for retailers to continue to carry Star Wars. What's really interesting is looking at where we are now in 2025, or whenever it is you're viewing this video, recorded in April 2025, is almost everything that's coming out now is from the original films. And in fact, the original film, there's a big emphasis on, I think Hasbro's even calling it the Return to Tatooine, which they're really supporting that Cantina playset, HasLab, by putting out lots of characters from the original movie. We've had, a new version of Tatooine Luke and Leia, and we've got Han, Chewie, and Obi-Wan in the wings. We just had a new Bantha announced. We had the Mos Eisley Streets playset, which does not connect to the Cantina. Sad. All right, but that's a whole other issue. I guess you could just put it next to it. Too bad they don't have little tabs. All right, so moving forward, the original movies are still driving sales completely, and that's because they are classic. It's like, the Beatles or Snow White, the original one, or, there's certain things that just are classic and part of pop culture, and not just pop culture, but just American culture in general. They've become a fabric or part of the fabric of our society. And Star Wars, the original 77 film, really is that. While the other ones have been great, the vast amount of the public actually is not aware of pretty much anything outside of the original movie. They may know there's other movies. They may have heard of Jabba the Hutt and a few other things, and that Vader's Luke's father. spoiler alert. But for the most part, your common, everyday, average person thinks of Star Wars as the 1977 film, and then there's been a whole bunch of other stuff that they really aren't that knowledgeable about. So, noting that we're now in this phase where we're getting, it's like everything old is new again, it's interesting to look back and see kind of what I call the 3 phases of modern Star Wars collecting. So let's kind of go through that. The first phase, Power of the Force 2, which I kind of look at that as going all the way through Power of the Jedi and kind of culminating in the 300th Boba Fett. That figure was very different from what had come before. The aesthetics of Power of the Force 2 included things, well, like, your super buff characters, Lando and Luke and all those guys were totally ripped in the 90s, and that's because that's the way toys were in the 90s. Almost every character was huge and ripped, different toy lines. And that's what Star Wars, when they came out with Power of the Force 2, was just following in the current trend of toy making, if you will, doing very buff characters, superheroes, et cetera, et cetera. And it wasn't until a couple of years into Power of the Force 2 that they did a kind of a reset and released characters that were more accurate to the film, like Blast Shield Luke was and there was a new Leia that kind of made up for the original monkey-faced Leia and buff Luke. But that's still part of Power of the Force 2. Power of the Force 2 sort of went from super buff to starting to get into movie accurate, but we're still getting the same articulation, the 5 points of articulation, if you will, right? So let me grab it. So this guy here, right? So he's got 1, 2, 3, and he's got leg articulation, but it's a little hampered by the robes. But this was basically very typical of what you got with Power of the Force 2, right? 5 points of articulation. Is there a waist swivel? Oh, there's a waist swivel. So, there is a waist swivel on that guy. All right, which is something the original figures didn't have. There was, no waist swivel on these guys. In fact, some of them, like the Stormtrooper, didn't even have or Gamorrean Guard, or some of the Ewoks didn't even have heads that rotated. All right, so Power of the Force 2 is definitely then dominated by the buff aesthetic and the limited articulation. We got a few figures like the Vader with removable helmet that introduced a swivel wrist for the first time to allow him to have more articulation with lightsaber, which was revolutionary at the time. But like I said, with the 300th Boba Fett that came out, that really brought things to a different level. Not just in terms of articulation, but it was more in scale. The figures started being more movie accurate scale to each other. Chewbacca was the same size, more or less, as Han Solo in the original Power of the Force 2. And now that we had post 300 Boba Fett, we were starting to get figures that, Chewbacca was now the right height. So that's what I sort of consider the first phase of modern Star Wars collecting, is Power of the Force 2 through Power of the Jedi. The next phase is more or less post Episode 2. So when we had Episode 1 come out, we had a dedicated line for Episode 1, Phantom Menace, which actually wasn't even called Phantom Menace on the packaging because Hasbro wasn't told the name of the movie. They were just told Episode 1 to try to keep the lid on things. So, and then Power of the Force, so when Episode 1 product was on shelf, you actually had 2 completely different Star Wars lines. You had Power of the Force, it was the freeze frame, and then the Comtech were the last of the Power of the Force 2 figures. And those were on shelf as a separate line, a separate SKU, a separate assortment from Episode 1. So that was kind of the, I suppose Episode 1 figures were kind of the end of that Power of the Force 2 aesthetic. We were still getting slightly limited articulation, and we were still getting kind of the same, everyone in the same scale, what sort of defined that first phase of modern Star Wars. That second phase, as I said, which kicked off with the 300th Boba Fett, while that was originally a premium figure, eventually that level of detail, deco, and articulation found its way into the line post-Episode 2, which I call the Saga era. So that was when you had the gold Saga card, the blue Saga card, then you had the white cards. There were lots of different, there wasn't, one, there was sort of the Legacy collection. There was a lot of, they renamed it a lot, but that whole period of blue cards, gold cards, the white Stormtrooper and Clone Trooper cards, the 30th anniversary line, all of that I call the saga era, because that was, for episode 2, there was not a dedicated line. There was one Star Wars line where they brought in, it was the first time that classic figure characters from the original trilogy and then characters from now the prequel trilogy were being sold in the same assortment. So to me, that is the second phase of modern Star Wars collecting, defined by, again, combining prequel and classic trilogy. And now we had much more articulation, but by much more, I mean we had things like elbow swivels, if you will. We didn't yet have ball-jointed elbows or wrists, but we were getting kind of the same type of articulation that Darth Vader with removable helmet from Power of the Force 2 had. So the one that came with Zuckuss and Ishi Tib and Piet, that wave, the one that was like really hard to find for the longest time. So that's kind of, there's your difference, is that second phase is defined by characters from multiple, trilogies and increased articulation and scale. And then the final phase, no shocker, is the vintage collection, which while it did have a start and stop, it's been consistent in delivering highly articulated figures in 3 3/4. So that's also when we started getting, well, basically kind of definitive versions of each character, more or less. And while the vintage collection did start and stop, even when it wasn't being released on photo-backed cards, like when the 3 3/4 was Black Series for a while, that was confusing. Black Series was an annual theme. It was not meant to be a toy line, but it's become the 6-inch series. That's a whole other video. So again, even though the vintage series started and stopped, the figures that came during that period, starting about 2012, marks that third phase. And I think one of the interesting ways to kind of mark this is the bounty hunters. So it's really interesting because while we've gotten so many Lukes and so many Vaders and so many Chewbacca's over the years, we haven't gotten that many, shall we say, Dengars, right? We've had three Dengars. So we had the Power of the Force 2 one, then we had the Saga Collection one, and then we had the Vintage Collection version. And that's a really good way of defining and looking at these three eras, because for the most part, all of the bounty hunters, the ones on the Executor from Empire, they have all had, Boba Fett may have more, but 3 tools, 3 releases. And you could see how each phase had kind of not a hard stop, but it had a soft stop and a start over. And you could really track things like, okay, every time they release a Bosk, that is a new phase. And I'm not talking about, they had like the 5 points of articulation Bosk that came out, around the time of the Disney movies. I mean the fully articulated version. So yeah, again, we had our Power of the Force 2 one, we had a Saga Collection Bosk, and then we had a Vintage Collection Bosk. So that's very much, I think, a really good way of looking at it, is the amount of time before a bounty hunter is redone. And while we have Dengar coming out in 2025, it's the same figure as 2012, just with less deco. So I don't consider that a new Dengar. It's just a repaint or a less paint. But that's a really good way of marking it, is looking at the bounty hunters. And, I'll keep using Dengar as an example. He's a great marker of how to differentiate and delineate the different phases of modern Star Wars collecting. And again, it's crazy because modern Star Wars collecting has now been going for 30 years, where vintage collecting only went for 7. And the 10-year gap we had between the end of Power of the Force 1 and the start of Power of the Force 2, well, that is now a third of the amount of time that we've had for the modern line to go. It's out of control. It's hard to track. There have just been thousands of figures. But looking at it in those 3 phases, and then where do we go from here? Are we about to enter a 4th phase? I'm going to say no. I think we're kind of petering out here. There's going to be more content, but between prices, royalty, and all of the other factors, tariffs hitting the toy industry, I think we're all kind of prepared for a sort of slow decline, especially because kids don't play with toys anymore. They play with iPads and phones and headsets and, that kind of thing. More's the pity. But I think it's really interesting to kind of take a look back, and I'd like to know your guys' thoughts. You know, what do you think of my definitions? Is that a good way of looking at sort of what I would call 3 phases of modern Star Wars collecting, and using the bounty hunters as a check mark to figure out what phase you're in? Love your thoughts on that. And again, as always, the best way to support this channel is sharing these videos with other people that may find them interesting. Because if you find them interesting, I bet others will too. Thanks for watching. Thank you for supporting. And again, always let me know what topics you'd love to see covered, because I'm always reading every comment and looking for suggestions. Thanks for watching, and see you guys in the next video.